Out here, when the headlights fade and the road swallows every sound, the night begins to breathe on its own. Truckers say there are stretches of highway where time doesn't move right, where voices whisper through CB static, and the glow in your mirrors doesn't always belong to another vehicle. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe it's something else riding alongside you, waiting for the miles to run out. Tonight, we're diving into the desolate heart of America's darkest highways, where 11 truckers learned that some roads were never meant to be traveled twice. I still remember the first time I saw her. Standing just past mile marker 37 on Interstate 80, somewhere between the Nebraska flatlands and the kind of nothing that makes you forget what state you're even in. It was close to 2 a.m., and I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Omaha to Sacramento for the better part of 12 hours, my eyes burning from staring at the white lines that never seemed to end. The highway was empty in that unsettling way it gets when you're the only soul awake for miles. When even the truck stops have gone dark, and the only company you have is the hum of your engine and whatever half-static country station you can pull from the air. That's when my headlights caught her. A woman in a pale dress, thumb out, hair hanging limp around her face like she'd been standing there through a rainstorm that never came. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep my foot on that gas pedal and pretend I never saw her. But there was something about the way she stood there, perfectly still, that made me ease off the throttle. Maybe it was the exhaustion playing tricks on me, or maybe it was guilt. Because I'd picked up hitchhikers before, back when I was younger and stupider, back when I still believed in helping strangers without wondering what they might cost you. I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder, and watched her in my side mirror as she walked toward the cab with a gait that felt too smooth, too deliberate, like she was gliding more than stepping. When she reached my window, she looked up at me with eyes that reflected my headlights in a way that didn't seem quite right. And she smiled. Not warm, not grateful, just acknowledging, like she'd been expecting me all along. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word, settling into the seat like she'd done this 1,000 times before. And for a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to convince myself this was normal, that picking up a lone woman on a deserted highway at 2 a.m. was just another good deed in a long line of forgettable kindnesses. We drove in silence for the first 10 miles, the only sound between us the rattling of my cargo and the occasional crackle of the CB radio picking up distant chatter from drivers I'd never meet. I kept glancing at her from the corner of my eye, trying to figure out where she was headed, why she was out here, what kind of desperation drives someone to hitchhike through the emptiest stretch of interstate in the Midwest. She didn't look at me, didn't fidget, didn't even seem to breathe. Just stared straight ahead through the windshield like she was watching something I couldn't see, something playing out in the distance that only she had access to. Finally, I broke the silence and asked her where she was going, my voice sounding too loud in the enclosed space of the cab, too human against the mechanical drone of the highway. She turned her head toward me slowly, deliberately, and when she spoke, her voice was soft and flat, like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere I didn't want to follow. She said she was going home, that she'd been trying to get home for a long time, and that she appreciated the ride more than I could know. I nodded, told her it was no problem, and asked where home was, hoping for a town name, a landmark, anything that would give me a sense of when I could drop her off and get back to the comforting isolation of driving alone. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring at me with those reflective eyes. And then she said something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. She said home was just past mile marker 37, that she'd been standing there, waiting for someone who would stop, someone who would see her, and that I was the first person in a very long time who had. The thing was, we'd already passed mile marker 37. I'd seen it right before I stopped for her, the faded white numbers barely visible in the beam of my headlights, and we were now at least 15 miles past it, closing in on mile marker 52, according to the signs that kept flashing by in the darkness. I told her we'd already gone past 37, that maybe she got confused, that maybe she meant a different marker or different stretch of road entirely. She shook her head slowly, still smiling that empty smile, and told me I'd see it again soon, that I always saw it again, that everyone who stopped for her always ended up seeing it again. My stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out across my back despite the heater blasting warm air through the vents. And I started thinking about those stories you hear from other drivers, the ones about phantom hitchhikers and cursed stretches of highway, where the dead walk among the living, where time loops back on itself and the road becomes a prison you can't escape. I wanted to pull over right then, wanted to tell her to get out, wanted to break whatever spell or curse or hallucination had wrapped itself around my brain, but my body wouldn't respond. My hand stayed locked on the wheel, my foot stayed steady on the gas, and the highway kept unrolling in front of us like a ribbon that had no beginning and no end. Then I saw it. Mile marker 37, looming out of the darkness like it had been waiting for me, like it had never left. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read those numbers over and over again, trying to convince myself I was misreading them, that exhaustion had finally broken my brain, and I was hallucinating the whole thing. But the marker was real, solid, undeniable, and as we passed it, I caught sight of something that made my blood turn to ice. Another figure standing on the shoulder, thumb out, hair hanging limp, pale dress catching the glow of my tail lights. I looked at the woman sitting beside me, and she was still there. Still smiling, still staring straight ahead. And I realized with a sickening certainty that I was looking at her, at the same woman, in the same spot, waiting for the next driver who would be stupid enough or kind enough or tired enough to stop. I slammed on the brakes, the truck shuddering and groaning as the cargo shifted violently behind me. And I turned to confront her, to demand answers, to beg for release from whatever nightmare I'd driven myself into. But when I looked at the passenger seat, she was gone. The door was still closed, the window still rolled up, and there was no sign she'd ever been there at all. No warmth left in the seat, no scent of rain or perfume. Nothing but the cold air and the hum of the engine, and the terrible certainty that I'd just lost something I couldn't name. I sat there on the shoulder of Interstate 80, engine idling, hands shaking, trying to piece together what had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was exhaustion, that I'd been driving too long and my mind had finally snapped, conjuring phantoms to keep me company in the loneliness of the endless road. But the other part, the part that had seen her eyes reflecting light that shouldn't have been there, the part that had watched mile marker 37 appear twice in the same night, knew better. I pulled back onto the highway, hands gripping the wheel so tight my fingers went numb, and I drove. I drove past mile marker 37 again and again, each time seeing her standing there, each time feeling the pull to stop, each time forcing myself to keep going. The sun came up eventually, burning away the darkness and the fog and the terror. And when I finally crossed into Wyoming, the markers returned to their normal sequence, and the woman disappeared from my rearview mirror. But I still think about her sometimes. Late at night when the highway stretches empty and the CB radio crackles with voices that might not be human. I think about the drivers who did stop after me, who picked her up and listened to her soft, flat voice tell them she was going home, who watched mile marker 37 appear in their headlights over and over until they couldn't tell the difference between driving forward and standing still. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting by that marker, patient and smiling, knowing that someone will always stop. Because the road is long and lonely, and we all need to believe we're still capable of kindness, even when kindness might be the thing that traps us forever. I never believed in ghosts or spirits or any of that supernatural nonsense until the night I picked up a voice on Channel 19 that shouldn't have existed. My name's Landon, and I've been running long-haul routes through Nevada for the better part of 15 years. Long enough to know every truck stop, every speed trap, every stretch of desert highway that feels like it goes on forever without ever really taking you anywhere. I'd always kept my CB radio on during night drives, mostly for company, mostly to hear other drivers complaining about traffic or weather or the price of diesel at the next station. It was background noise, familiar and comforting. The kind of constant chatter that made you feel less alone, even when you were hundreds of miles from the nearest town. But that night, driving through the empty heart of Nevada on Route 50, the so-called loneliest road in America, the radio had been silent for hours. No voices, no static, nothing but the occasional burst of interference that sounded like wind screaming through a tunnel. I checked the equipment twice, made sure everything was working, made sure I hadn't accidentally switched to a dead frequency. Everything seemed fine, but the silence pressed against my eardrums like something physical, something alive. And I found myself gripping the mic harder than necessary, desperate to hear another human voice break through the emptiness. Then, just past midnight, the radio crackled to life with a voice that was too clear, too close, like the speaker was sitting right beside me in the cab. He called himself Breaker 19, which struck me as odd because nobody actually used breaker codes anymore. That was old-school trucker slang from the 70s and 80s, back when CB radios were the only way to communicate on the road. But his voice was friendly, almost cheerful, and he asked if I was the Peterbilt heading eastbound on Route 50. I confirmed, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease, and he launched into easy conversation like we were old friends catching up after years apart. He warned me about a jackknifed semi about 40 miles ahead, told me to take the detour through Austin if I wanted to avoid the backup, and gave me a weather report that predicted heavy fog rolling in around 2 a.m. I thanked him, asked for his location, asked if he was running the same route, but he just laughed. A low, static-edged sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up. And told me he was always on this road, that he'd been running it longer than I could imagine. Something about the way he said it felt wrong, felt too deliberate, like he was hinting at something I wasn't supposed to understand yet. But I was grateful for the company, grateful for the warnings, and I kept talking to him as the miles dissolved into darkness and the desert landscape became nothing but shadows and stars. Breaker 19 knew things he shouldn't have known. He told me about accidents before I reached them, describing twisted metal and shattered glass in detail that felt too vivid, too personal. He predicted weather changes down to the minute. The fog rolled in at exactly 2 a.m. like he'd summoned it himself, thick and white and suffocating, turning my headlights into useless beams that barely penetrated 3 feet ahead. He knew when I was getting tired, when my eyes started burning and my head started nodding, and he'd start talking louder, faster, telling stories about other drivers he'd guided through these same stretches of highway. Other souls who'd been lost and alone, and grateful for his voice, cutting through the silence. I asked him how long he'd been driving, where he was based out of, whether he ever stopped at the truck stop in Ely. But his answers were always vague, always circling back to the road itself, to the endless miles of asphalt and the strange communion that happened between drivers who spent too many nights under the same empty sky. Hours passed like that, his voice becoming a constant presence in my cab. And I started to rely on it. Started to feel like I couldn't drive without it. Like the silence that had terrified me before would swallow me whole if Breaker 19 ever stopped talking. The sun came up around 6, burning through the fog and painting the desert in shades of red and gold. And I felt a surge of relief, knowing I'd made it through another night. I thanked Breaker 19 for keeping me company, for the warnings and the weather reports and the stories that had kept me awake when exhaustion tried to drag me under. He told me it was his pleasure, that he'd always be there if I needed him, that all I had to do was turn on Channel 19 and call his name. Then the radio went silent, the static fading into nothing, and I was alone again, with just the hum of my engine and the empty road stretching toward the horizon. I thought about him on and off throughout the day, wondering who he was, wondering if I'd hear from him again the next time I ran this route. When I finally pulled into a truck stop outside of Reno, I grabbed lunch and struck up a conversation with an older driver who'd been running Nevada routes since before I was born. I mentioned Breaker 19 casually, asked if he'd ever heard the name, ever talked to him on the CB. The old man's face went pale, his coffee cup freezing halfway to his lips, and he asked me to repeat what I'd just said. I did, describing the voice, the warnings, the way he seemed to know everything about the road before it happened. The old man set his cup down with shaking hands and told me that Breaker 19 was a legend among Nevada drivers, a ghost story they told to scare rookies and remind veterans that some debts on the road never get paid. According to the old man, Breaker 19 had been a real driver back in the early 80s, a guy named Marcus Webb who ran Route 50 religiously, who knew every curve and every danger like he'd memorized the highway in his sleep. He was famous for helping other drivers, for warning them about hazards, for staying on Channel 19 through every shift and offering guidance to anyone who needed it. But one night, during a heavy fog just like the one I'd driven through, Marcus crashed his rig into a canyon wall while trying to avoid a deer. They found his truck 3 days later, radio still on, still transmitting static on Channel 19, even though Marcus was long dead. After that, drivers started reporting hearing his voice on that same channel, always at night, always on Route 50, always offering warnings and weather reports and companionship to anyone lonely enough or desperate enough to answer. Some said it was just interference, just their minds playing tricks after too many hours on the road. But others swore they'd been saved by his warnings, that they'd avoided crashes and breakdowns and deadly weather because Breaker 19 had guided them through the darkness. The old man leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper, and told me that the frequency had been officially unused since 1983, that the FCC had retired it after too many reports of strange transmissions that couldn't be explained. He said if I'd really been talking to Breaker 19, then I'd been talking to a dead man, a spirit trapped on the highway he loved too much to ever leave. I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to think it was coincidence, that maybe someone was using an old handle as a tribute, that maybe the stories had gotten twisted over the years and turned a helpful driver into a ghost story for gullible truckers. But when I got back to my rig and checked the CB logs, something I rarely did but felt compelled to do now, I found the recordings from the previous night. Every conversation I'd had, every warning Breaker 19 had given me, was there in digital format, time-stamped and archived, except when I played them back, All I heard was my own voice talking to static, asking questions to empty air, thanking silence for guidance that never came. There was no second voice, no Breaker 19, no friendly companion who'd kept me awake through the loneliest stretch of highway in America. Just me, alone in my cab, having a conversation with something that didn't exist on any frequency the living could access. I sat there for a long time, staring at the CB radio like it might suddenly explain itself, might crackle back to life and tell me this was all a joke, all a misunderstanding. But it stayed silent, and I realized with a cold certainty that whatever I'd been talking to that night wasn't bound by the rules of technology or physics or the world I thought I understood. I still drive Route 50 sometimes, still keep my CB tuned to Channel 19 out of habit or hope, or some twisted need to know I wasn't losing my mind. And late at night, when the road is empty and the fog rolls in thick and white, I sometimes hear static that sounds almost like a voice, almost like someone calling my name, almost like Breaker 19 is still out there, still guiding lost drivers through the darkness, still running the highway he died on 40 years ago and can't seem to leave behind. The storm hit me somewhere between Little Rock and Memphis, the kind of violent downpour that turns your windshield into a waterfall and makes the highway disappear into sheets of white noise. My name's Eliza, and I've been hauling freight across the South for 6 years now. But I'd never seen rain like this. The kind that makes you question whether you should pull over and wait it out or push through and pray your tires don't hydroplane into the ditch. My wipers were working overtime, squeaking and stuttering against the glass, barely keeping up with the deluge that seemed to come from every direction at once. The radio had gone to static an hour ago, and my GPS kept losing signal, leaving me alone with nothing but the sound of rain hammering against metal and the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the world in stark, terrifying clarity. That's when I saw the sign for the rest stop, a faded blue marker promising food and fuel and shelter from the storm that was trying to shake my truck apart. I didn't recognize the name, something generic like Riverbend Plaza or Crossroads Station, but I didn't care. I needed to get off the road before visibility dropped to 0, and I ended up as another statistic in some highway patrol report. I took the exit, following the narrow road that curved away from the interstate and into what felt like deeper darkness, thicker rain, heavier air. The rest stop appeared suddenly through the downpour, a squat building with flickering lights that cast strange shadows across the empty parking lot. There were no other vehicles. No other drivers seeking shelter. Just my rig and the building and the rain that never seemed to stop falling. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and made a run for it, getting soaked in the 5 seconds it took to reach the door. Inside, the air was stale and too warm, smelling like old coffee and something else I couldn't identify. Something chemical and sweet that made my stomach turn. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting the space in sickly yellow illumination that hurt my eyes. There was a clerk behind the counter, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight and a face that seemed to shift every time I looked directly at it. Too angular one moment, too soft the next, like I was seeing her through water that wouldn't stay still. She didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge my presence, just kept staring down at something on the counter that I couldn't see from where I stood dripping on the worn linoleum. I grabbed a coffee from the ancient machine in the corner, watching the dark liquid sputter into a styrofoam cup that felt too thin, too fragile. The vending machines along the wall were mostly empty, their glass fronts reflecting my exhausted face back at me in ways that seemed distorted, wrong somehow. I tried making small talk with the clerk, asking how long she thought the storm would last, whether other drivers had stopped through tonight. She looked up at me then, and I swear her face was different. Younger, maybe, or older, I couldn't tell. and she said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away that the storm had been going on for a very long time, that most people didn't notice, that I should drink my coffee and rest while I still could. Her words sent ice down my spine despite the oppressive heat, but I nodded and took my coffee to one of the plastic booths near the window. Outside, the rain continued its assault, and I realized I couldn't see my truck anymore, even though I'd parked right in front. The parking lot had disappeared into a wall of water and darkness, and for a moment I felt a surge of panic, wondering if my rig was still there, or if it had somehow vanished while I was inside. I stood up, pressing my face to the glass, trying to make out shapes in the storm. That's when I noticed the clerk was standing right behind me, so close I could feel her breath on my neck. And when I spun around, her face was different again. Features rearranging themselves like a puzzle that couldn't decide what picture it was supposed to make. She asked if I was looking for something, if I'd lost something important, and her voice had changed too, become higher and younger and somehow more desperate. I backed away, mumbling that I just wanted to see if my truck was okay, if the storm was letting up. She smiled then, and her teeth seemed too white, too many, too sharp. And she told me trucks come and go, but most of them don't leave the way they arrived. I didn't understand what she meant, and I didn't want to understand. I just wanted to get back on the road, back to the familiar terror of driving through bad weather instead of whatever wrongness had infected this place. I made for the door, abandoning my coffee on the table. And when I pushed outside, the rain had stopped. Completely stopped. No drizzle, no mist, no evidence that minutes ago I'd been fighting through the worst storm I'd ever seen. The sky was clear and full of stars, the parking lot dry as bone, and my truck sat exactly where I'd left it, looking like it had never been touched by water. I stood there in the sudden silence, my clothes still soaking wet from my run inside, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew had just happened. Behind me, I heard the door to the rest stop close with a soft click, and when I turned around, the building was dark. Completely dark, every light extinguished. No sign of the clerk or the flickering fluorescents or the coffee machine that had sputtered brown liquid into my cup. I ran to my truck, fumbling with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Once inside, I locked everything, started the engine, and pulled out of that parking lot faster than I should have. Tires squealing on the dry pavement. I got back on the interstate and drove without stopping. Drove until the sun came up and Memphis appeared on the horizon and the world felt real again. It wasn't until I stopped for fuel that I realized I had no idea how much time had passed. My phone said it was 6 a.m., but my dash clock said 2 p.m., and my GPS insisted I'd only driven 30 miles when I knew I'd covered at least 200. Nothing matched up. Nothing made sense. And when I tried to find that rest stop on the map later, searching every exit between Little Rock and Memphis, it wasn't there. No Riverbend Plaza, no Crossroads Station, nothing but regular stops I'd been to 100 times before. Other drivers told me later I'd probably hallucinated from exhaustion, that the storm had been real, but everything else was my brain playing tricks after too many hours behind the wheel. But I know what I saw, what I felt, what that clerk's shifting face looked like in the fluorescent light. I know that building existed for the time I was inside it, that it pulled me off the highway for reasons I'll never understand, that it let me go when it could have kept me there forever in that flickering yellow space where time moved wrong, and faces couldn't decide what shape they were supposed to hold. I still drive that route sometimes. Still watch for rest stops I don't recognize. Still feel my heart race when storms roll in and visibility drops to nothing. And I wonder about the drivers who stopped at that same place before me. The ones who didn't make it back to the interstate, the ones whose trucks sat in that parking lot growing older and rustier, while their drivers wandered through a building that existed in the space between the storm and the silence. Trapped in fluorescent forever, with a clerk whose face would never stop changing and coffee that would never get cold. They told me not to open the crate. That was the first rule they gave me when I picked up the job in Wichita. A rush delivery that paid 3 times my usual rate to haul a single sealed cargo container from Kansas to a warehouse outside Portland. The dispatcher was clear about it, almost aggressive in the way he repeated the instructions. Don't stop unless it's an emergency. Don't open the container under any circumstances. Don't ask questions about what's inside. Just drive straight through, deliver it to the address, collect the payment, and forget the whole thing ever happened. My name's Ray, and I've been hauling freight for 23 years. Long enough to know that jobs paying triple rate usually come with complications you don't want to think about too hard. But my mortgage was overdue, and my daughter needed braces, and the money was too good to turn down. So I signed the papers and backed my rig up to the loading dock without asking a single question about what I was agreeing to transport. The crate itself looked ordinary enough. A standard 20-foot shipping container, steel walls painted industrial gray, secured with heavy-duty locks that seemed excessive for legitimate cargo. It took 4 men to load it onto my flatbed using a forklift. And I noticed they were all wearing gloves and breathing masks like they were handling something toxic or dangerous. When I asked if there were any hazardous materials I needed to declare, the dispatcher just shook his head and handed me the manifest, which listed the contents as industrial equipment, with no further details. The weight distribution felt off when I pulled away from the dock, like whatever was inside kept shifting toward one side. But I chalked it up to poor packing and focused on getting out of Wichita before rush hour traffic made the interstate unbearable. The first 200 miles were fine. I made good time through Kansas and into Colorado, the container sitting quiet and still behind me, the roads clear and the weather cooperative. I stopped once for fuel and a bathroom break, checking the straps and locks out of habit, making sure everything was secure for the mountain passes I'd be hitting once I reached Wyoming. That's when I heard it for the first time. A soft scraping sound coming from inside the container, like something heavy being dragged across metal flooring. I froze, hand on the lock, listening to the sound repeat itself in slow, deliberate intervals. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. My first thought was that the cargo had come loose, that whatever industrial equipment they'd loaded was sliding around and would damage itself if I didn't secure it properly. But then I remembered the dispatcher's face when he'd given me the instructions, the way his voice had dropped to almost a whisper when he told me not to open it. And I backed away from the container like it was radioactive. I got back in the cab and pulled onto the highway, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the sound, that it was just the settling of metal or the expansion and contraction of steel in the changing temperature. But an hour later, it happened again. Louder this time, more insistent. Scrape, 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 like fingernails or claws dragging across the inside walls, trying to find purchase, trying to find a way out. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I turned up the radio, drowning out the sound with classic rock that couldn't quite mask the rhythmic scratching that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I thought about pulling over, thought about calling the dispatcher and demanding to know what I was really hauling. But the contract had been clear. No stops, no questions, no excuses. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part that had survived 2 decades on the road, by knowing when not to look too closely at the cargo, I understood that whatever was in that container was something I didn't want confirmed. Night fell as I climbed through the Rockies, the temperature dropping and my breath fogging the windshield despite the heater running full blast. The scraping had stopped hours ago, replaced by something worse. A low, rhythmic thumping that made the entire trailer shake with each impact. Thump, thump, thump. Like something inside was throwing itself against the walls, testing the strength of the steel, measuring the distance between captivity and freedom. I checked my mirrors obsessively, watching the container rock slightly with each impact, watching the locks hold firm, even as whatever was inside grew more violent and more desperate. Part of me wanted to floor it, wanted to drive straight through without sleeping until I reached Portland and could unload this nightmare onto someone else. But the mountain roads were treacherous and icy, and pushing too hard would send me over the edge into a canyon where nobody would find me until spring thaw. I pulled into a rest area around midnight, parking far from the other trucks, not wanting anyone to hear what I was hearing, not wanting to explain why my cargo was making sounds that no industrial equipment should make. I sat in my cab with the engine running and the doors locked, staring at the container in my side mirror and trying to decide if I was losing my mind or if something genuinely impossible was happening behind those sealed steel walls. That's when the thumping stopped and the screaming started. Not human screaming, not animal screaming, but something in between that made every primitive instinct in my body scream back at me to run. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, a sound like metal tearing and air escaping and something wet and organic being compressed under massive pressure. And then silence so complete, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my cab drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching the container for any sign of movement, any indication that whatever had been making those sounds was still alive or still trying to escape. When the sun finally came up, I inspected the locks again, running my hands over the steel walls, looking for dents or scratches or any evidence of the violence I'd heard during the night. The container was pristine, unmarked, impossible. The locks were still secure, the seals unbroken, and if I hadn't heard those sounds myself, I would have sworn the cargo had been sitting quiet and still since Wichita. But I had heard them, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong with this job, that the money wasn't worth whatever psychological damage I was inflicting on myself by continuing to haul this thing across the country. I called the dispatcher from a truck stop in Wyoming, my voice shaking as I told him I was hearing sounds from the container, that I needed to know what I was transporting, that I deserved to know what kind of risk I was taking. He was quiet for a long time. So long I thought the connection had dropped. And then he said in a voice that sounded nothing like the man I'd spoken to in Wichita that I needed to finish the delivery, that turning back now would violate the contract in ways that would have serious consequences, that some cargo was meant to arrive at its destination, regardless of what happened along the way. He hung up before I could respond, and when I tried calling back, the number was disconnected, like it had never existed in the first place. The rest of the drive to Portland was a waking nightmare. The sounds from the container became constant, scraping and thumping and that terrible, not quite human screaming that made my teeth ache and my vision blur with exhaustion and fear. I drove through Idaho and into Oregon without stopping, without eating, without sleeping. Because stopping meant being alone with that container in the darkness, and I couldn't handle that again. Other drivers gave me strange looks at red lights, pointing at my trailer and mouthing questions I couldn't hear through the glass. And I wondered if they could see something I couldn't. If whatever was inside had started to manifest in ways that were visible from the outside. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel and told myself that I just had to make it to Portland, just had to deliver this thing and collect my payment and never think about it again. The warehouse was in an industrial area outside the city, a massive concrete structure with no windows and no signs indicating what company operated there. Two men in hazmat suits were waiting for me when I pulled up, and they worked quickly to disconnect my trailer from the cab, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. That I wasn't the first driver who'd hauled something like this across the country. I asked them what was in the container, what I'd been transporting for the last 3 days. But they didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. They just handed me an envelope thick with cash and pointed toward the exit. And I understood that my part in whatever this was had ended. I drove away from that warehouse feeling like I'd aged 10 years in 3 days, like something inside me had been permanently altered by proximity to whatever had been sealed in that container. The money was all there, exactly what they'd promised. But I knew I'd never spend it without remembering the sounds, without wondering what had been desperate enough or angry enough or hungry enough to throw itself against steel walls for 72 hours straight. I quit long-haul trucking 2 months later, told my wife I wanted a job where I could come home every night, where I never had to wonder what kind of cargo I was transporting or what kind of people were willing to pay triple rate to move things that shouldn't be moved. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scraping sound, that thumping, that terrible screaming that wasn't quite human. And I wonder if the container ever made it to its final destination, or if it's still sitting in that windowless warehouse, waiting for the next driver desperate enough to agree to transport something that should have stayed locked away forever. I've been running night routes through New Mexico for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the desert highways could throw at me. Dust storms that turned day into night, mirages that made the road shimmer like water, wildlife that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as fast. My name's Amari, and I haul electronics from Albuquerque to Phoenix 3 times a week, always taking the overnight shift because the pay is better and the traffic is non-existent. The loneliness doesn't bother me anymore. I've gotten used to the hours of silence, the endless stretch of asphalt cutting through empty land, the way the stars seem close enough to touch when you're the only vehicle for 50 miles in any direction. But 3 weeks ago, something changed on that route. Something that made me question whether I was really as alone out there as I'd always believed. It started with headlights in my rearview mirror, appearing around 1 a.m. on a stretch of Highway 60 that runs through the most desolate part of the state. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another trucker running the same route, probably on the same tight deadline, probably just as tired and ready to get home as I was. But after 20 minutes, the headlights were still there, maintaining the exact same distance behind me, no matter how fast or slow I drove. When I sped up to 75, they sped up. When I dropped to 60, they dropped to 60. The spacing never changed, never wavered, like whoever was driving back there had locked onto my speed and was mirroring it perfectly. I tried the CB radio, calling out to see if the driver wanted to chat or pass or just acknowledge they were there. Static. I switched channels, tried again, got nothing but dead air and the occasional burst of interference that sounded almost like breathing. The headlights stayed constant in my mirror. 2 bright points of light that never blinked, never dimmed, never seemed to belong to an actual vehicle I could make out in the darkness. I told myself it was just the distance and the desert air playing tricks with my vision. That if I looked hard enough, I'd see the outline of a truck or the glow of running lights. But no matter how long I stared into that mirror, all I could see were those 2 headlights, burning steady and bright like eyes watching me from somewhere I couldn't reach. After an hour, I decided to pull over at a rest area and let whoever was behind me pass. I needed to use the bathroom anyway. Needed to stretch my legs and shake off the weird tension that had settled into my shoulders from watching those lights for so long. I took the exit, watching my mirror as I slowed down, expecting to see the headlights continue past on the highway. But they followed me. They took the same exit, maintained the same distance, pulled into the rest area parking lot, and stopped about 50 yards behind my truck. I sat there with my engine running, watching those lights in my mirror, waiting for a door to open or a driver to step out or something to happen that would prove this was just another trucker taking a break. Nothing. The lights stayed on. The vehicle, if it was a vehicle, stayed still, and the silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't get out of my truck. Every instinct I had told me to stay locked inside, to get back on the highway, to put as much distance as possible between me and those headlights that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I pulled out of the rest area and merged back onto Highway 60. And within seconds, the headlights reappeared behind me. Same distance, same intensity, like they'd been waiting for me to make that exact decision. My hands were sweating on the wheel now, my breath coming faster, and I started doing calculations in my head about how far I was from Phoenix. How long I'd have to endure this before I reached civilization and witnesses and the safety of other people who could confirm what I was seeing. The highway stretched on forever, empty in both directions except for me and whatever was following me. I tried every trick I could think of. Sudden lane changes, random speed variations, taking exits and then immediately getting back on the highway. But nothing worked. The headlights stayed locked on my position like they were tethered to my bumper by invisible rope, like distance and physics didn't apply to whatever rules they were following. At one point, I slammed on my brakes, dropping from 70 to 40 in seconds, hoping to force whoever was behind me to pass or crash or do something that would break this terrible symmetry. The headlights slowed with me, perfectly synchronized, and I realized with ice flooding my veins that this wasn't a person making decisions. It was something automatic, something programmed. Something that had chosen me as its target and wouldn't stop following until I reached my destination or until something worse happened that I didn't want to imagine. Dawn started breaking around 5 a.m., the sky turning from black to deep blue to the pale orange that promised sunlight and normalcy. I kept checking my mirror, waiting for the headlights to disappear or for the sun to reveal what had been chasing me through the night. But they didn't disappear. They stayed bright and constant even as the sky got lighter, even as I should have been able to see the shape of a vehicle behind them. There was nothing there, just 2 points of light floating in the air about 8 feet off the ground. No truck, no car, no motorcycle. Nothing but the lights themselves burning steady and unwavering like stars that had fallen to earth and decided to follow me home. I white-knuckled it all the way to Phoenix, too terrified to stop again, too exhausted to think clearly about what was happening. When I finally pulled into the distribution center where I was supposed to deliver my cargo, the sun was fully up, and the parking lot was full of other trucks and workers and normal people doing normal jobs. I sat in my cab for a long time, hands shaking, watching my mirrors. The headlights were gone, vanished, like they'd never been there at all, like I'd hallucinated the whole 8-hour ordeal. I told myself that's exactly what had happened, that exhaustion and isolation had broken something in my brain and created phantom pursuers to keep me company through the loneliest part of my route. But when I got out and walked around my truck to start the unloading process, I saw them. Burn marks on my trailer. 2 perfect circles scorched into the metal exactly where headlights would have been shining if something had been following too close for too long. The marks were hot to the touch, smoking slightly in the morning air, and they smelled like ozone. And something else I couldn't identify. Something chemical and wrong that made my eyes water and my throat close up. I stood there staring at those marks for I don't know how long, until one of the workers asked if I was okay, if I needed help with the unloading. I nodded. Said I was fine. Said I'd just had a long night and needed coffee. He looked at the burn marks on my trailer, frowned, and asked what the hell I'd been hauling that could leave damage like that. I didn't have a good answer for him, so I just shrugged and said I had no idea, that the marks weren't there when I left Albuquerque, that maybe something had happened on the road I didn't notice. He seemed skeptical, but let it go, moving on to help with the cargo while I stood there staring at those two perfect circles of burned metal like they were evidence of something I wasn't ready to accept. The marks were real. Whatever had been following me wasn't a hallucination or exhaustion-induced paranoia. It had left physical proof on my truck that I couldn't deny or explain away. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation, that maybe some other truck had gotten too close on the highway, that maybe debris had kicked up and caused the damage, that maybe I'd backed into something and forgotten about it. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen in my mirror for 8 hours straight, and I knew that nothing human or mechanical could have made those marks. The burn patterns were too uniform, too precise, too hot. When I touched them again after they'd cooled, the metal was warped and discolored in a way that suggested extreme heat, the kind of heat that would have melted through steel given enough time. I called the shop and told them to send someone to inspect the damage, that I might need repairs before my next run. They said they'd look at it, but when the mechanic arrived and examined the truck, he looked as confused as I felt. He'd never seen damage like it, he said. It looked almost like a directed energy burn, like something had been focusing heat onto a specific spot for an extended period. He recommended I file a claim with my insurance company and file a police report about vandalism, because there was no mechanical explanation for what had happened to my trailer. I couldn't tell him the truth, that something without a body or engine or visible form had followed me across 80 miles of empty desert while I drove. How do you explain that? How do you report that to anyone without sounding like your brain has finally cracked under the strain of too many lonely nights on the road? So I made up a story about someone at a truck stop who'd hassled me, made up a description of a vehicle I'd never seen, and filed a report that went nowhere because there was no evidence except 2 burn marks that defied explanation. The insurance company denied my claim, saying the damage was too strange, that it didn't match any standard vehicular accident pattern, that they suspected I'd caused it myself for fraudulent purposes. I was left paying for repairs out of pocket and trying to figure out if I should even get back on that route or if whatever had followed me was waiting to follow me again. I took a week off work, called in sick, and tried to process what had happened. I researched unexplained phenomena on the internet, read about other drivers who'd reported strange lights following them on deserted highways, found forums dedicated to discussing supernatural encounters on America's loneliest roads. Some people blamed aliens, others blamed government experiments. Still others insisted it was some kind of interdimensional entity that fed on fear and exhaustion. Nothing felt satisfying. Nothing felt true. But they were all at least acknowledging that what I'd experienced wasn't unique, that I wasn't the only person who'd encountered something that didn't fit into the world as I understood it. The first night back on Highway 60, I was terrified. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind me made my heart rate spike, made me grip the wheel so hard my hands went numb. But nothing followed me. The route was clear, normal, empty in the way deserts are supposed to be empty. I made it to Phoenix without incident, made the return trip to Albuquerque without seeing anything unusual, started to convince myself that whatever had happened was a one-time event, that the thing, whatever it was, had decided I wasn't worth pursuing anymore. I ran that route 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, each time with less fear, each time more convinced that I'd been spared or released or forgotten by whatever had taken such an interest in me. Then, on the 4th run after the incident, the headlights came back. Not at 1 a.m. like before, but earlier, around 11:30 p.m., appearing as soon as I passed the same stretch of highway where they'd first materialized. My stomach dropped and my mouth went dry. Because I'd thought I was done with this. I'd thought whatever had followed me had moved on to some other unfortunate driver. But there they were, 2 points of light in my mirror, maintaining that perfect synchronized distance, burning with that same intensity that wasn't quite natural. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to think rationally about what was happening and what I should do. This time, I didn't try to outrun them or shake them or pull into rest areas. This time, I did something different. I pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that led out into the desert, away from any civilization, away from any possibility of help or witnesses or rescue. I drove for 10 minutes, watching those headlights stay perfectly positioned behind me the entire time, and then I stopped. I turned off my engine, killed my lights, and sat in complete silence and darkness, waiting to see what would happen when I stopped running. The headlights continued forward, passing by my truck on the desert road, and for the first time, I could see what they were attached to. There was no vehicle. There was no truck or car or motorcycle or anything with wheels or an engine. The headlights were floating in midair, 2 perfect spheres of burning light that drifted past my windshield, like they were made of pure energy, like they were alive in ways that violated every law of physics I understood. They stopped about 100 yards past me and hovered there, burning in the darkness. And I realized they were waiting to see if I'd start driving again, waiting to see if I'd continue my journey toward Phoenix. I understood then that this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident or a haunting or a supernatural curse. Something was hunting me, tracking me, watching me every time I ran that route. And it would keep following me, keep burning marks into my truck, keep appearing in my mirror until I either understood why or gave up driving altogether. I sat there for hours, staring at those floating lights, and they stared back, 2 burning eyes in the desert night that never blinked, never faded, never looked away. When dawn finally came, they disappeared like they always did. And I drove back to the highway in silence, knowing that the next time I take that route, they'll be waiting for me again. I've heard a lot of stories in my 20 years of driving, but nothing prepared me for what happened on Route 395 through the mountains of Montana during the worst blizzard I'd ever encountered. My name's Eli, and I pride myself on being someone who doesn't scare easy. Someone who can handle any weather condition or mechanical failure or unexpected crisis that the road throws at me. But that night, somewhere between Missoula and the Idaho border, I experienced something that shattered every rational belief I held about how the world worked. The snow had started around sunset, light flakes at first. But by 9 p.m. it had turned into a full whiteout, the kind of blizzard that reduces visibility to maybe 10 feet and turns the highway into a guessing game, where you're constantly wondering if you're still on the road or about to slide off a cliff into darkness. I was considering pulling over at a rest area when I saw lights ahead through the snow, not the steady glow of a truck stop or the random flickers of another vehicle, but something organized. Something deliberate. As I got closer, the lights resolved into the shape of a convoy, a line of semi-trucks stretching ahead of me into the storm. their headlights cutting through the blowing snow in a perfect formation. There must have been 5 or 6 of them, running bumper to bumper, their running lights creating a tunnel of illumination through the chaos. Without hesitation, I eased my truck into line behind the last one. Grateful to have something to follow, grateful to have the lead trucks breaking trail through the accumulating snow and showing me where the road actually was. The convoy was moving at a steady 40 miles per hour, slow enough to be safe, but fast enough to keep making progress, and I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in hours. I followed them for what felt like hours, the snow continuing to fall with relentless intensity, the wind howling against my cab, the convoy staying perfectly aligned like they were connected by invisible rope. I tried to raise them on the CB to ask where they were headed, to find out if they knew about conditions further up the mountain, but got only static. I switched channels, tried again, got the same dead air that seemed to mock my attempts at communication. The other trucks never wavered, never signaled, never acknowledged that I existed. They just kept driving forward in their perfect formation, and I kept following because the alternative was to drive blind into a storm that had already reduced visibility to near zero. That's when I started noticing something wrong with the trucks ahead of me. The frost that covered them wasn't building up like it should have been on a night this cold and snowy. Instead, it looked like it had accumulated over days or weeks. Thick layers of ice and frozen precipitation that created grotesque, bulbous shapes on the trailers and cabs. The trucks looked ancient, worn like they'd been driving through this blizzard not for hours, but for years. And when I got close enough to see through the cab windows of the truck directly in front of me, I saw the driver, a man sitting perfectly upright, hands gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead with eyes that didn't blink, face covered in a thin layer of frost that made him look less like a person and more like a statue carved from ice. My first instinct was to brake, to drop back and get away from this convoy of impossibility that didn't make sense. But the snow behind me was already accumulating, and I knew if I lost sight of the trucks ahead, I'd be completely lost. So I stayed in line, told myself I was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress, that the frost and the strange appearance of the driver were just tricks of the storm and my overactive imagination. But more trucks appeared on the road, joining the convoy from exits I hadn't seen, merging in from side roads that seemed to come out of nowhere. Each new truck that joined the line had the same thick coating of ancient frost, the same impossible accumulation of ice that suggested these vehicles had been driving this route through eternal winter for longer than I wanted to contemplate. The highway started to feel familiar in a way that didn't make sense. I'd driven Route 395 dozens of times, but this section looked subtly wrong. The mile markers were in the wrong order, the road curved in ways I didn't remember, and the landscape visible through breaks in the snow seemed to repeat itself over and over. We'd passed the same burned-out barn 3 times in the last 20 minutes. The same overturned fence post appeared and disappeared in the storm at regular intervals. The convoy was looping, I realized with a surge of panic that made my hands shake on the wheel. We were driving in circles, and the other trucks either didn't notice or didn't care, just kept maintaining their perfect formation, kept driving at their steady 40 miles per hour, kept staring straight ahead with those frost-covered faces that never turned, never blinked, never acknowledged that anything was wrong. I tried to break free from the convoy, tried to pull out and drive past the lead trucks. But every time I accelerated to move up in line, the truck ahead of me would accelerate as well. Maintaining that perfect spacing, that consistent distance that felt less like accident and more like intention. When I dropped back, the trucks behind me slowed down. keeping me centered in the formation, keeping me trapped between the truck in front and the trucks behind. My radio was now picking up static that sounded almost like voices, like people whispering in languages I didn't recognize, layered over each other in a chaotic babble that made my teeth aching and my vision blur at the edges. The blizzard continued with unrelenting fury, and I realized with creeping horror that the snow was no longer accumulating on my windshield. My wipers were still running, but the glass was staying clear, in a way that violated the laws of weather and physics. Looking out at the convoy, I understood why. We weren't actually driving through the blizzard. We were driving alongside it, separated from the storm by some kind of barrier that kept the snow and wind at a distance, while allowing us to see the chaos continuing all around us. The frost on the other trucks was so thick now, it was obscuring their shapes, making them look less like vehicles, more like monuments or tombs, like they'd been entombed in ice and were being transported to some mass grave in the frozen mountains. I don't know how long we drove like that. Time felt strange and unreliable inside the convoy. Hours and minutes losing all meaning. The radio voices got louder, more distinct, and I started catching fragments of words in English mixed with the foreign languages. They were saying my name. Over and over, the voices in the static were saying Eli, 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 in a rhythm that matched the pulse of my heartbeat, that synchronized with the rumble of my engine. The truck directly in front of me had turned completely white now, so covered in frost that I couldn't see inside the cab at all. Couldn't tell if there was still a driver in there or if the vehicle was being piloted by something else entirely. Then, suddenly, the convoy started to break apart. The trucks ahead began peeling off the road one by one, turning onto side roads that appeared out of the storm and disappeared back into it like gateways between worlds. I watched each truck make the turn in perfect sequence, maintaining their spacing even as they left the main highway, and I realized with absolute certainty that I was next. My truck was drifting toward an exit I hadn't noticed moments before, and I wasn't controlling it. My hands were still on the wheel, but the truck was steering itself, pulling me away from the main route, pulling me toward something waiting in the white darkness ahead. I tried to fight it, tried to turn the wheel hard in the opposite direction, but the steering was locked, immovable, like the truck had decided where it was going, and I was just along for the ride. The exit approached, and I could see something waiting on the side road, shapes that might have been trucks or might have been something else entirely, half visible through the swirling snow. The last coherent thought I had before the turn was a question that still haunts me. How many convoys are driving through Montana's mountains on nights like this? Locked in eternal loops through blizzards that never end, picking up new drivers who made the mistake of following lights in the storm. My truck turned onto that side road with an inevitability that felt like fate. Like the decision had been made long before I ever encountered that first convoy on Route 395. The moment my wheels left the main highway, the blizzard intensified around us. The storm that had been at a distance suddenly surrounded the truck completely. Snow and wind, battering against the cab with renewed violence. But inside, everything was eerily calm. My engine hummed at the same steady pitch, my tires gripped the road with perfect traction, and the truck maintained its trajectory like it was following a path marked only for vehicles like itself. For trucks that had already surrendered to whatever force controlled this stretch of Montana landscape. The side road twisted and turned through terrain I couldn't quite see through the snow, climbing higher into the mountains with each passing minute. I tried talking to myself, tried rationalizing what was happening, tried to construct explanations that involved mechanical failure or hallucinations or anything other than the obvious truth. That I'd been pulled into something outside the normal rules of reality. My CB radio had stopped picking up the voices, and now just emitted a low, constant hum that vibrated through my bones and made my teeth ache. The mile markers I passed were all showing the same number: 47. Mile marker 47, repeated endlessly like the road had decided to stop measuring distance and was content to loop forever at the same location. Then, as suddenly as it had intensified, the blizzard cleared. My truck emerged from the wall of white into a landscape that defied every geographical principle I understood. Spread out below me was a valley that shouldn't have existed in Montana. Tropical trees with snow clinging to their leaves, a lake that steamed despite the frigid air, and most impossibly, a massive clearing filled with trucks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all covered in frost so thick they looked like sculptures carved from ice, all arranged in perfect rows like they were parked in some kind of celestial truck stop that existed in a pocket dimension adjacent to the real world. My truck descended the winding road toward this impossible gathering, and I realized I could see into the cabs of the other vehicles now. Each one held a driver, perfectly preserved in frost, hands on wheels, faces pointing straight ahead, eyes open but seeing nothing. Their clothes ranged from modern to ancient. I saw drivers in trucker caps from different decades, saw styles of clothing that dated back 50 years or more, saw uniforms that suggested some of these vehicles predated the interstate highway system itself. These weren't recent arrivals. These were trucks that had been collecting in this valley for generations, drivers who had taken wrong turns or followed phantom convoys or made deals with forces that didn't care about the normal flow of time. My truck came to a stop in an empty parking space that seemed to have been waiting for me, positioned between a truck from the 1970s and one that looked like it had rolled off an assembly line in the 1950s. I tried to turn off the engine, tried to open the door, tried to regain even the smallest amount of control over my own vehicle. But nothing responded. The truck sat idling, and I sat frozen in the driver's seat, watching the other vehicles and wondering if this was where I would stay forever. Just another frost-covered monument to drivers who'd made the mistake of trusting the wrong lights in the storm. Then I heard a voice. Not through the radio, not through any external speaker, but directly in my mind, speaking in a tone that carried weight and age and knowledge that extended beyond human comprehension. It told me I was welcome here, that I'd been chosen, that my journey on the normal roads had ended and my true purpose was about to begin. It said I would join the convoy when the next blizzard came, that I would help collect other drivers who made the mistake of following phantom trucks through Montana's mountains, that I would help guide new arrivals to this valley where time moved differently and the roads led nowhere except back to the beginning. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to fight against the paralysis creeping through my limbs, but my body wouldn't obey. The frost started forming on my windshield, spreading inward from the edges, and I could feel the temperature inside my cab dropping degree by degree, cold that went deeper than physical sensation and seemed to freeze something fundamental in my chest. I understood then that the transformation had already begun, that I was becoming like the other drivers, would soon be indistinguishable from the hundreds of vehicles arranged in this impossible valley. But something stopped it. Somewhere in my mind, in the part of me that refused to accept what was happening, I found a reserve of will that fought against the encroaching cold and the paralysis and the voice that kept whispering about my new purpose. I don't know how or why. Maybe exhaustion broke through whatever spell was being cast. Maybe the resistance of a human consciousness could only be suppressed so far before it rebelled. But suddenly, I could move. My hand slammed down on the ignition, my foot hit the accelerator, and my truck roared to life with an intensity that seemed to anger the very landscape around me. I spun the wheel hard, and my truck lurched forward, away from the parking space, away from the orderly rows of frozen vehicles, toward the far edge of the valley where the forest thickened and the terrain became impassable. The other trucks seemed to shudder with the movement, like they were trying to block my escape. But I floored the accelerator and drove straight into the trees, branches snapping against my windshield, undergrowth crushing beneath my tires, the truck bouncing and lurching as I abandoned the road entirely and drove through pure wilderness. The valley began to dissolve behind me, the impossible tropical trees fading away, the steaming lake disappearing, and suddenly I was back in the blizzard, back on a road that looked almost familiar, almost normal. My truck's headlights cut through the snow, and ahead I could see the main highway, the exit marker for Route 395, salvation, in the form of pavement and direction and the normal world. I drove toward it with every ounce of speed my vehicle could manage, and when I finally merged back onto the interstate, the blizzard was already starting to clear. The sky was opening up, stars becoming visible, and the temperature was rising back to something that matched the season. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a 24-hour diner and sat in a booth for hours, unable to order anything, unable to do anything but stare at my hands and try to convince myself that what had happened was real. The waitress asked if I was okay, and I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe being pulled into a valley that exists outside normal space and time? How do you explain that hundreds of trucks are parked in an impossible location, their drivers frozen and waiting for the next blizzard? I never took Route 395 again. I switched to southern routes, stayed away from Montana entirely, and tried to rebuild some kind of normal life. But every winter, when the first heavy snow falls, I hear that hum on my CB radio, and I see phantom lights in my rearview mirror. I know they're coming for me. Know they're waiting for me to make one mistake, to take one wrong turn on a snowy night. And I know with absolute certainty that if they ever catch me again, I won't have the strength to escape a second time. Whatever is collecting trucks in that impossible valley will have its driver, and I'll join the frozen ranks of those who followed lights in the storm and learned too late that some convoys never reach their destination. The way station appeared on Route 10 outside Phoenix like it had always been there. A squat concrete building with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. My name's Cole, and I've been hauling freight across Arizona for 12 years. And I'd swear I'd never seen this particular station before. But there it was, sitting on the shoulder of the highway like it had been waiting for me specifically. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low and angry in the western sky, turning everything the color of dried blood. I had a full load of construction materials heading to Tucson, and I knew I'd probably get stopped at one of the official way stations anyway. So I figured I might as well pull in here and get it over with. The gravel crunched under my tires as I eased my truck off the highway and into the small parking area in front of the building. The attendant was waiting for me before I even cut the engine. She stood in the doorway of the station, a woman who could have been anywhere from 40 to 80. Her face lined and weathered in ways that suggested she'd spent her entire life under the Arizona sun. Her hair was pulled back in a braid, so tight it seemed to stretch her skin, and her eyes were the color of old copper, catching the light in ways that didn't seem entirely natural. She gestured for me to come inside, and something in that gesture, something in the slowness and deliberation of the movement, made my stomach tighten with an unease I couldn't quite explain. But I needed to get weighed, needed to get my paperwork checked. so I grabbed my logbook and my insurance documents and walked toward the building, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the heat and the long drive making me jumpy. The inside of the station was cooler than it had any right to be, the air conditioning running so hard it felt almost painful after the desert heat. The walls were covered with outdated posters about safety regulations and weight limits, and there was a scale against the far wall that looked ancient. Its mechanical face yellowed and cracked. The attendant closed the door behind me with a soft click that sounded like a trap being sprung, and she smiled at me with teeth that were too white, too even, like they'd been manufactured rather than grown. She told me in a voice that was surprisingly gentle that I needed to be weighed, that she needed to know exactly how much I was carrying. Not just my truck and cargo, but something deeper, something that couldn't be measured on a standard scale. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, some kind of weird attempt at humor that didn't quite land. But her expression didn't change, didn't acknowledge that she'd said anything unusual. She just gestured toward the scale and told me to step on it. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. But I was tired and thirsty, and I just wanted to get through this interaction and get back on the road. So I walked to the scale and stepped on it, watching the needle swing across the face and settle on a number that matched my weight almost exactly. The attendant studied the reading with intense focus, tilting her head like she was listening to something the scale was telling her that I couldn't hear. She wrote the number down in a leather-bound logbook without looking at me, her pen moving in precise, deliberate strokes. Then she looked up at me with those copper-colored eyes and said something that made my blood run cold. She said I was too heavy. Not my truck, not my cargo, but me specifically. She said I was carrying too much weight, that I'd been accumulating it for years, that it had settled into my bones and my organs and my soul in ways that made it impossible for me to keep moving forward. I told her she was crazy, that I'd just stepped on a scale and weighed what I'd expected to weigh, that whatever she was talking about was nonsense. But even as I said it, I knew she was right. I could feel it. A heaviness that had nothing to do with my physical body. A burden that had been growing incrementally over years until it had become something that weighed me down more than gravity itself. The attendant set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. She told me in that same gentle voice that I should get back on the road, that I should keep driving, but that I should understand that I was too heavy to keep driving much longer. She said that every mile I traveled, every hour I spent behind the wheel, I was getting heavier. She said that eventually the weight would become so great that I wouldn't be able to move, that I'd be stuck in one place, frozen by the burden of everything I'd been carrying without acknowledging it. I asked her what she meant, asked her to explain what kind of weight she was talking about. She smiled that too white smile and said it was different for every driver, that I needed to look inside myself to understand, that the scale had already told her everything she needed to know. I backed away from her desk, back toward the door, ready to leave this place and never come back. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, sealed somehow. And when I looked back at the attendant, she was still sitting at her desk, still smiling, still writing in that leather-bound logbook with her pen that never seemed to run out of ink. She told me I could leave whenever I wanted, that no one was holding me prisoner, that the door would open when I was ready to leave. But as I pulled on the handle again, straining with all my strength, I realized the truth. The door wasn't locked from the outside. It was locked from the inside of me, locked by the weight of everything I'd been denying, everything I'd been running from, everything I'd packed into my chest over years of driving alone and never stopping long enough to process any of it. The room started to spin, and I gripped the edge of the scale to steady myself. My hands felt heavier than they should have, like they were made of lead instead of flesh and bone. Looking down at my arms, I could see them sagging slightly, like gravity had suddenly increased its pull on me alone. The attendant's voice came from somewhere very far away, telling me that I could go back to my truck if I wanted, that I could get back on the road, but that I should understand what was happening to me. She said every mile I drove from this point forward, I would get heavier. She said my truck would struggle against my weight, that the engine would labor, that eventually my rig would simply stop moving because it couldn't bear the burden of carrying someone so loaded down with sin and regret and accumulated damage. I didn't know what sins she was talking about. I didn't remember doing anything so terrible that it would manifest as physical weight, as gravity pressing down on me from the inside. But as I stood there in that impossible way station, I started remembering things I'd tried very hard to forget. The woman I'd abandoned in Flagstaff because she wanted me to stay, and I wanted to keep moving. The daughter I'd only seen once because I was always running, always on the next haul, always too busy to be a father. The friends I'd left behind, the promises I'd broken, the life I'd sacrificed in pursuit of miles and freedom, and the empty comfort of the open road. The weight of all of it crashed down on me at once, and I staggered backward, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The attendant watched with that small, knowing smile, and she told me that now I understood, that now I could leave if I wanted, that the door would open because I'd finally acknowledged what I'd been carrying all along. I looked at the door, and somehow I knew she was right. The weight was still there, still pressing down on me, but it was no longer locked away, no longer denied. It was real and present and acknowledged, and that acknowledgement was the only key I needed to escape this place. I stumbled toward the door, and it swung open before my hand could reach the handle. Like it had been waiting for the exact moment I accepted the truth of what the attendant had told me. The desert heat hit me like a physical blow after the artificial cold of the station, and I gasped for air that felt thick and heavy in my lungs. My legs felt weak. My entire body felt like it was made of something denser than it should be. Like every atom had been compressed under the weight of years of running and denying and pretending that I could outrun my own history. I made it to my truck and climbed into the cab, my movements slow and deliberate, each motion feeling like I was moving through water instead of air. The engine started without resistance, and I pulled back onto Route 10, merging into the flow of traffic with other vehicles whose drivers probably had no idea that they were traveling alongside someone who'd just been weighed in ways that standard scales couldn't measure. The highway stretched ahead of me, endless and familiar, and I tried to convince myself that the encounter with the attendant had been some kind of heat-induced hallucination, that the stress of years on the road had finally caused my mind to fracture and create elaborate metaphors for the emptiness I'd been feeling. But I could feel it. The weight. It was subtle at first. Just a slight pressure in my chest, a barely perceptible heaviness in my limbs. But as I drove, as the miles accumulated, as the sun sank lower on the horizon and the landscape began to turn purple and gold, I noticed that my truck was struggling in ways it never had before. The engine was working harder to maintain speed. My tires seemed to grip the road with more difficulty. And when I pressed the accelerator, the response was sluggish, delayed, like the truck was protesting the burden it was carrying. By the time I reached Tucson to make my delivery, I could feel the weight pressing down on me so heavily that it took genuine effort to climb out of the cab. My joints ached like I'd aged 20 years in the span of a single afternoon. The loading dock workers helped me unload the cargo, and one of them commented that I looked terrible, that I should see a doctor, that something seemed seriously wrong. I told him I was fine, just tired, just needed some rest. But as I was leaving the warehouse, I caught sight of myself in a window reflection, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. I looked older. Not just tired or worn down, but genuinely older. The lines on my face had deepened. My hair seemed to have more gray than it had that morning, and my entire posture had changed. I was hunched forward slightly, like I was trying to curl in on myself to escape the weight pressing down from above. I touched my face with trembling fingers, wondering if this was real or another manifestation of the heat and stress, wondering if the attendant had done something to me, something that would continue to manifest as I drove. I decided right then that I needed to go home. I needed to see my daughter, needed to try to repair the damage I'd done through years of absence and broken promises. I needed to face the weight properly, instead of trying to outrun it like I'd been doing for 2 decades. I turned my truck around and headed north toward Flagstaff, where my ex-wife had raised our daughter, where I hadn't been in 5 years despite promising I would visit. The drive that should have taken 4 hours seemed to stretch on forever, every mile adding to the pressure in my chest, every passing minute making my body feel heavier and more burdened. The weight kept intensifying. By the time I reached Flagstaff, I could barely move. Getting out of my truck required me to grip the doorframe and pull myself down with both hands, my legs almost buckling under the combined burden of my physical body and whatever metaphysical heaviness the attendant had awakened in me. I made my way to my ex-wife's house, each step an effort, each movement a battle against gravity that seemed to have turned hostile and personal. When my ex-wife opened the door, she gasped and stepped back. She asked what was wrong with me, why I looked like I'd been sick for weeks, why I seemed to be having trouble standing. I told her I needed to see our daughter, that I needed to talk to her, that I needed to try to make things right after all these years. She was reluctant. Told me that Sarah had her own life now, that she didn't want to see me, that showing up like this was exactly the kind of selfish, demanding behavior that had driven us apart in the first place. But she called Sarah anyway, and my daughter came downstairs. A woman now, not the little girl I remembered from my last visit, looking at me with eyes that held years of disappointment and hurt. She asked me what I wanted, why I was there, her voice cold and distant in ways that added another layer to the weight pressing down on me. I tried to explain about the way station, about what the attendant had told me, about how I'd finally understood what I'd been carrying all these years. Sarah listened with an expression that cycled between disbelief and anger. And when I finished, she told me that showing up with some elaborate metaphor about weight and burden wasn't going to fix anything, wasn't going to replace all the birthdays and school events and normal father moments I'd missed. The weight became almost unbearable then. I could feel it crushing down on me, making it hard to breathe, making it hard to stand. I sank into a chair in my ex-wife's living room, and for the first time in years, I cried. I cried for all the time I'd wasted, for all the distance I'd put between myself and the people I loved, for all the years I'd spent running when what I should have been doing was staying. My daughter watched me cry with an expression that slowly shifted from anger to something that might have been pity or might have been the beginning of understanding. She sat down across from me and told me that she appreciated the fact that I was finally acknowledging what I'd done, that it was better than the denial and excuses that had characterized our previous encounters. But she also told me that showing up now, years too late, with a weight I could barely carry, didn't automatically fix anything. It didn't restore the relationship. It didn't make up for the absence. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would require more than a single evening and more than words. She told me that I could start by taking some time off from driving, by actually being present instead of using my truck as an escape hatch from responsibility. I agreed to everything she said. I called my dispatch company and told them I was taking a leave of absence, that I needed to deal with some personal issues, that I didn't know when I'd be back. And as I sat in that house that night, surrounded by my ex-wife and my daughter and the accumulated weight of everything I'd been running from, I noticed something strange starting to happen. The weight wasn't decreasing exactly, but it was changing. It was transforming from something that crushed and suffocated into something that grounded and centered. Like the burden I'd been carrying was finally being distributed across my entire body instead of being concentrated in my chest where it had been choking me. Over the following weeks, as I spent time with my daughter and began to rebuild some kind of relationship with her, the weight continued to shift. The physical symptoms, the aging, the heaviness in my limbs, the difficulty moving, gradually subsided, replaced by a different kind of weight, one that felt more like purpose than like a curse. I started working a local job that let me sleep in my own bed every night. I started attending my daughter's work events and her social gatherings. I started being present in a way I'd never managed before. Sometimes I still think about that way station outside Phoenix and the attendant with the copper-colored eyes who forced me to confront what I'd been refusing to acknowledge. I've tried to find that station multiple times, taken the same route, stopped at the same mile marker, but it's never been there. Other drivers I've talked to swear there's no way station in that location, that there never has been. Part of me wonders if it was real or if it was some kind of psychological break, some manifestation of my own guilt and regret taking physical form. But real or not, the weight was real. The reckoning was real, and the changes it forced me to make were real. I don't drive anymore. Haven't sat behind the wheel of a truck in over a year. And while I miss the road sometimes, miss the endless horizon and the sense of freedom that came with it, I don't miss the weight. I don't miss the crushing burden of running from everything that mattered. And I think about all the other drivers still out there on the highways, still accumulating weight, still refusing to acknowledge what they're carrying until they encounter their own impossible way station, their own copper-eyed attendant who forces them to confront the truth about themselves and the life they've been living. I hope some of them find their way to understanding before the weight becomes too much to bear. I never wanted to transport human remains. In my 15 years of driving, I'd hauled everything from hazardous materials to livestock to things I'd rather not think about too closely. But I'd always managed to avoid the jobs that involved carrying the dead. Something about it felt wrong, felt disrespectful, felt like it crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross no matter how much the pay increased. My name's Cassie, and I pride myself on being professional and reliable, on taking whatever jobs came my way and completing them without complaint. But when my dispatcher called me 3 weeks ago and asked if I'd be willing to transport a shipment of cremated remains from Sacramento to a funeral home in Denver, I almost said no. Almost. But my rent was due, my truck needed new tires, and the pay was substantial enough that I couldn't justify turning it down. The urn came in a sealed box, wrapped in what looked like ceremonial cloth, delivered to my truck by a woman in a dark suit who handled it like it was made of glass. She didn't say much, just handed me a manifest and told me the delivery address in Denver, told me the urn needed to arrive intact and undisturbed, told me there would be a bonus if I delivered it within the time window specified on the paperwork. I loaded the box carefully into my sleeper cab, securing it with bungee cords on the small shelf above my bed, treating it with the respect I figured the deceased deserved. Then I hit the road, intending to make it to Denver in approximately 18 hours, breaking the drive into manageable chunks to stay within legal limits on hours of service. The first 6 hours were uneventful. I drove through the Sierra Nevada mountains as the sun set, watching the landscape turn from golden to purple to black, listening to talk radio and audiobooks to keep myself company in the cab. I stopped for fuel and food in a small town in Nevada, checked on the box of ashes to make sure everything was secure, and got back on the road feeling like I was on track to make my delivery on time without any complications. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and familiar, and I settled into the rhythm of driving that always came so naturally to me. The hum of the engine, the sensation of mile markers passing, the hypnotic quality of the endless road. Around 2 a.m., somewhere in the Utah desert, I started hearing sounds from the sleeper cab. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, thought my tired mind was creating phantom noises the way it did on long drives. But then I heard it again, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails or claws dragging across metal. I turned up the radio to drown it out, told myself it was probably just something loose in the back, probably just cargo shifting slightly due to road vibrations. But my stomach had tightened with an unease that I couldn't quite explain, a primal discomfort that went beyond rational thought. The scratching continued on and off for the next hour, each occurrence slightly louder, slightly more insistent than the last. I tried to ignore it, kept my eyes on the road, kept telling myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for what I was hearing. But around 3 a.m., as I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of desert with nothing but rock formations and darkness visible in my headlights, something happened that made my blood run cold. The box of ashes shifted. I didn't see it happen, but I felt it. A subtle movement in the sleeper cab behind me, a sliding sensation that suggested something heavy had moved across the shelf where I'd secured it. I pulled over immediately, heart pounding in my chest, and climbed into the sleeper cab to investigate. The bungee cords were still in place, still securing the box, but it had definitely moved. It was sitting closer to the edge of the shelf than it had been, like it had inched forward while I was driving. I checked the cords to make sure they were tight, made sure nothing had come loose, and tried to convince myself that I was just tired and paranoid and reading too much into normal settling of cargo. But as I was climbing back into the driver's seat, I heard the scratching again. Louder this time, more aggressive, and it was definitely coming from the box. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the road ahead, trying to decide if I should turn around and go back, if I should stop for the night and sleep at a rest area, if I should just keep driving and ignore whatever was happening in the back of my truck. The scratching stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence so complete it felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving faster than I should have. My hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my fingers went numb. The next 2 hours passed in tense silence. I kept waiting for the scratching to start again, kept glancing at my mirror, watching for any sign of movement in the sleeper cab, kept telling myself that there had to be a rational explanation for what I was experiencing. But as I crossed into Colorado and the sun started to rise over the eastern horizon, painting the landscape in shades of pink and orange, I heard something that made me question my sanity entirely. There was breathing coming from the sleeper cab. Not the sound of wind or settling cargo or anything mechanical. Actual breathing, rhythmic and deep and distinctly alive. I pulled over at the next rest area, hands shaking as I unfastened my seatbelt and climbed into the back. The box of ashes was still there, still secured, still looking exactly as it had when I'd loaded it in Sacramento. The breathing continued, steady and patient, and I realized it seemed to be coming from inside the box itself. I reached out to touch the ceremonial cloth, and it was warm. Warmer than it should have been. Warmer than anything sitting in an air-conditioned sleeper cab should be. The breathing got louder when I touched it, more emphatic, like whatever was inside knew I was aware of its presence. I yanked my hand back, breathing heavily, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't possible. The box contained cremated remains, ashes, nothing more. There was no way there could be anything alive in there. No way there could be anything with lungs that could breathe or fingernails that could scratch. But the evidence of my senses was undeniable. Something was in that box. Something that was breathing and moving and trying to communicate with me through the only methods available to it. I climbed back into the driver's seat and sat there for a long time, trying to decide what to do. I could call the funeral home and report what was happening. But how would I explain it? I could turn around and go back to Sacramento and demand answers from the woman who'd given me the shipment. But that would mean violating my contract and losing the substantial payment I'd been promised. I could pull the box out and open it, see what was actually inside. But something told me that opening that box would be a mistake. That whatever was in there should stay contained. The decision was taken out of my hands when I heard a sound like glass breaking, a high-pitched crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around in my seat and saw that the bungee cords had come loose somehow. They were hanging slack on either side of the shelf, and the box was tipping forward, tilting toward the edge. I scrambled into the sleeper cab, trying to catch it, trying to stabilize it before it could fall. But as my hands made contact with the box, it crumbled, literally crumbled. The cardboard disintegrated under my fingers, falling apart like it was made of paper-thin material instead of sturdy shipping material. The ceremonial cloth fell away, and what I saw inside made me scream. There were no ashes. There was a body, dried and mummified, and somehow still intact despite being cremated, according to the manifest. And the body was moving. Fingers twitched. The hollow eye sockets seemed to track my movement. The withered mouth opened and closed like it was trying to speak, trying to tell me something. And the smell that emerged was like opening a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. I scrambled backward, my body moving faster than my mind could process, and I tumbled out of the sleeper cab onto the gravel of the rest area parking lot. My hands were covered in dust and particles from the disintegrated box, and I could feel them on my skin like insects crawling. Like the essence of whatever had been in that box was transferring onto me, claiming me in some way I didn't understand. Other drivers at the rest area were staring at me, watching this woman on her hands and knees in the parking lot, clearly having a breakdown. I wanted to tell them what I'd seen, wanted to scream for help, but I knew how insane it would sound. How do you explain that a shipment of cremated remains contained an intact, still twitching corpse? I forced myself to stand up, forced myself to walk back to my truck on legs that felt like they were made of water. The sleeper cab was quiet now, the sounds of breathing and movement having stopped the moment I left. I climbed back inside carefully, half expecting the body to lunge at me, half expecting the mummified figure to come to life in ways that violated every law of nature and biology. But it was still now. Lying on the shelf where the box had been, skeletal and withered, and somehow more unsettling in its stillness than it had been when it was moving. The body was wearing clothes. A suit, I realized. Old-fashioned and dusty, but still identifiable as formal wear. There was a name tag pinned to the jacket, and I leaned closer to read it, my heart hammering in my chest. The name was Eleanor Hutchins, and the date beside it was from 1967, 57 years ago. This wasn't a recent death. This wasn't someone who had been cremated and was somehow still moving. This was something that had been dead for more than half a century and had somehow been preserved or animated or something else entirely that I lacked the vocabulary to describe. I backed out of the sleeper cab slowly, my eyes never leaving the body, and I climbed into the driver's seat with a sense of unreality that made everything feel like I was moving through a dream. The highway was calling to me, the deadline was still pending, and I had to make a choice. Continue to Denver and deliver this impossible cargo, or stop and report what I'd found and accept that I would probably spend the rest of my life in some kind of psychiatric facility being treated for delusions. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. I don't know why I made that decision. Some part of me, the part that was professional, the part that completed contracts no matter what, the part that had learned over 15 years of driving that some things were better left unexamined, decided that I would see this through. I would deliver Eleanor Hutchins to Denver, would leave her at the funeral home address, would collect my payment, and would probably spend the rest of my life trying not to think about what I had witnessed. The drive to Denver took on a nightmarish quality after that point. Every mile felt like I was traveling deeper into something dark and wrong. Every hour that passed made me feel more contaminated by proximity to the impossible thing lying in my sleeper cab. I couldn't hear any more sounds from the back. No scratching, no breathing, no movement. But that made it worse somehow. The silence felt active, felt like Eleanor was waiting. Felt like she was studying me in return, observing this living woman who had become her temporary vessel. I stopped once for fuel, and when I approached the pump, I noticed other people's reactions to me. They would see me, make brief eye contact, and then look away quickly, like I was projecting. Something wrong. Something that made them uncomfortable on an instinctive level. One gas station attendant refused to take my payment, just handed my credit card back and told me to leave. An older woman waiting in line moved several feet away from me when I approached. It was like Eleanor's presence was bleeding out of my truck and affecting everyone who came near me, like her wrongness was contagious. By the time I reached Denver, the sun was setting again, turning the sky shades of purple and gold that seemed obscene given what I was about to do. The funeral home was in an older part of the city, a brick building with ornate architecture that looked like it had been there since the early 20th century. I pulled around back to the loading area and sat in my truck for 10 minutes, trying to gather the courage to walk inside and explain that I had a delivery. Trying to prepare myself for whatever reaction the funeral home staff would have when they discovered what was actually in my vehicle. A man in a dark suit emerged from the back door, and when he saw my truck, he nodded like he'd been expecting me. He approached the driver's side window, and I rolled it down with a trembling hand. He told me he was Mr. Reeves, that he was the funeral director, that he'd been waiting for this delivery for a very long time. I told him there was a problem with the shipment, that something was wrong, that what I was transporting didn't match the manifest. He smiled. Not a pleasant smile, but a smile that suggested he knew exactly what was in my truck and why I was upset about it. He told me that Eleanor Hutchins had requested in her will that her remains be transported across the country by a living driver, that she wanted to travel one last time before being laid to rest, that she had very specific instructions about how the journey should be conducted. He said that what I'd experienced, the sounds, the movement, the manifestation of her corpse, were all part of the process, that Eleanor had always been a restless spirit, that she couldn't quite settle into permanent rest without one final journey. He told me that I should consider myself honored, that not many drivers were chosen to transport someone like Eleanor, that what I'd experienced was a sacred trust. I told him I didn't want to be honored, that I wanted to unload this cargo and never think about it again. Mr. Reeves nodded understandingly and told me that I could absolutely do that he and his staff would take Eleanor from here. He called out to two other men in dark suits, and they emerged from the funeral home carrying what looked like a ceremonial casket. Together, they began unloading my truck, carrying Eleanor's remains with the kind of reverence and care that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd moved her, that Eleanor had probably been transported this way multiple times by multiple drivers, all of them probably having similar experiences to the ones I'd had. As they lifted Eleanor from my sleeper cab, I could have sworn I heard a sound. Not breathing, not scratching, but something like a sigh. Like gratitude, like Eleanor was satisfied with her journey and was finally ready to rest. When they'd placed her in the casket and carried her back inside the funeral home, Mr. Reeves approached my window again. He handed me an envelope containing cash, more than I'd been promised, significantly more, and told me that Eleanor appreciated my service, that she had specifically requested additional compensation for drivers who completed her transport. I took the envelope without speaking, and Mr. Reeves leaned down to look at me through the window. He told me something that I've thought about every day since. He said that Eleanor had been dead for 57 years, but she wasn't the only one. He said there were others like her, other restless spirits who needed to travel, other drivers who would be contacted with similar jobs, other trucks that would carry the impossible across America's highways. He said it was a privilege and a burden, and that I'd now been marked as someone willing to participate in something that existed at the edges of the world most people inhabited. I didn't go back to trucking after that delivery. I really tried to go back to normal routes and normal cargo, but I couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor. Couldn't stop hearing that final sigh. Couldn't stop wondering if she was still traveling somehow, still moving through the country in the dark of night. A month after dropping her off, I received a call from a different dispatcher offering me another job, another shipment of cremated remains that needed transport. I hung up and never answered their calls again. I work in logistics now, office-based, never touching cargo that involves human remains. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about Eleanor Hutchins and wonder if she's still out there on the highways, if another driver has taken her across the country, if the mysterious funeral home in Denver is really just a way station for the restless dead who need one more journey before they can accept their eternal rest. And I wonder if I made the right choice by refusing that second job, or if I missed an opportunity to understand something fundamental about the nature of death and journey, and the strange ways that some souls refuse to stay put. The money from Eleanor's transport is still in the bank, untouched, because spending it feels like accepting something I'm not ready to accept, like acknowledging that what happened was real and that I'm complicit in something I can never fully understand. There are stretches of highway that feel wrong in ways you can't explain until you've experienced them yourself. And the section of I-40 between Flagstaff and Holbrook, Arizona is one of them. My name's Blake, and I've been running cross-country routes for 19 years. But I'd never paid particular attention to that specific stretch until 3 months ago when my GPS started malfunctioning in ways that made no sense. It wasn't a gradual failure. One moment the device was working perfectly, showing me my location and my route and the distance to my next stop, and the next moment it was looping. The map on the screen began cycling through the same mile of highway over and over again, the coordinates staying static while the GPS insisted I was moving forward, that I was covering distance, that I was making progress toward Holbrook, even though the landscape outside my windshield remained exactly the same. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. Thought maybe I'd driven through a dead zone or passed near something that was interfering with the satellite signal. I pulled over at a rest area and tried rebooting the device. But the same thing happened. The map showed me looping endlessly through the same stretch of highway, a single mile that seemed to have no beginning and no end. I turned off the GPS entirely and decided to navigate using the mile markers visible on the highway itself, trusting in the numbered signs that should have indicated my progression eastbound toward New Mexico. But something felt off about those markers too. I started paying attention to them, really paying attention. And that's when I realized the impossible truth. The mile markers weren't progressing sequentially. I'd pass mile marker 287, then a few minutes later mile marker 291, then backward to 288, then forward to 293. The numbers were random, jumping around without any logical pattern, like the highway had decided that conventional geography no longer applied to this particular stretch. My odometer was still advancing, showing that I was covering distance. But the physical markers on the road suggested I was trapped in some kind of loop where distance and space had become negotiable concepts rather than fixed physical realities. I pulled over again and checked my watch, timing how long it took me to drive from one marker to the next. 7 minutes, I noted. Then I'd reach the next marker and time the distance again. 7 minutes, then 7 minutes again, always 7 minutes between markers. But the markers themselves were showing different numbers in random sequences. Other drivers on the road seemed oblivious to what was happening. Cars would pass me going the opposite direction, trucks would overtake me heading eastbound, and none of them seemed to notice anything strange about the landscape or the markers or the way the highway seemed to be folding in on itself. I tried flagging someone down at a rest area, tried asking if they'd noticed anything weird about the mile markers, but they all looked at me like I was insane. One trucker told me the markers were perfectly fine, that he'd just passed mile marker 291 and mile marker 292 in sequence, that everything seemed normal. But I knew what I was seeing. I knew that the markers had been showing completely different numbers when I'd passed them minutes earlier. I decided to keep driving, convinced that eventually I would break through whatever was causing this phenomenon. That if I just kept moving forward, I would eventually reach Holbrook and escape whatever was happening on this stretch of highway. Hours passed. I drove until my eyes were burning and my shoulders ached. But the landscape never changed. The same red rock formations appeared and disappeared in my mirrors. The same patches of desert scrub vegetation lined the roadside. The same vendors' billboards for mysterious attractions. See the world's largest petrified wood. The meteor crater is 50 miles ahead. Cycled through my field of vision over and over again. My fuel gauge started dropping, and I realized with creeping panic that I would eventually run out of gas if I didn't find an exit or a fuel station. I searched for an off-ramp, searching for any break in the highway that might lead to civilization or escape, or anything that would suggest I was still living in a world governed by normal physical laws. And then I saw one, an exit for a rest area that I was sure hadn't been there moments before. I took the off-ramp with a surge of desperate hope, pulling into a parking lot that looked exactly like every other rest area I'd ever stopped at. A squat concrete building, a few parking spaces, bathrooms, and vending machines inside. I pulled up to the fuel pump, relieved to see that this place actually had fuel available, and I started pumping gas with shaking hands. While the tank was filling, I checked my odometer again and noted the mileage. Then I got back on the highway, paid close attention to my speed, and timed exactly how long it took me to reach the next mile marker. When I saw the marker appear in my headlights, I checked my odometer again and my watch simultaneously. According to my odometer, I'd traveled 8.7 miles. According to my watch, 62 minutes had passed. but the mile marker I was approaching showed 289. I'd started at 287. I should have been well into the 290s, well past Holbrook, well into New Mexico by now. But the markers insisted I'd barely moved, that I was still trapped in the same section of highway, that I'd been driving in circles without ever actually progressing anywhere. I pulled over on the shoulder, put the truck in park, and sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to understand what was happening. The radio was crackling with static that almost sounded like voices, like distant conversations being broadcast through layers of interference. When I turned up the volume to try to understand what the voices were saying, the static resolved into something almost coherent, a repeating phrase that sounded like, "Stay on the road, stay on the road, stay on the road." I turned off the radio and sat in the silence, listening to nothing but the hum of my idling engine. In the distance, I could see the same rest area I'd just left, visible from the shoulder of the highway, even though I was sure I'd driven miles away from it. As I watched, a truck pulled out of the rest area parking lot and merged onto the highway heading eastbound. It looked familiar. It looked, in fact, exactly like my truck. Same color, same make, same model. I watched it drive ahead of me, watched it pull further away into the darkness, and then I watched it approach the same mile marker I was parked near. When the truck reached the marker and drove past it, I could have sworn I saw my own face in the driver's side window, staring ahead with the same exhausted expression I was probably wearing at this very moment. I put my truck in gear and started driving again, following the phantom truck that might have been me or might have been another driver caught in whatever trap this stretch of highway had become. We drove for hours, maintaining a consistent distance, neither of us gaining on the other, both of us progressing through the same 7-minute intervals between randomly sequenced mile markers. The rest area appeared again, and the truck ahead of me pulled in. I watched as it parked, watched as a figure got out and walked into the building. Then another truck appeared behind me, identical to mine, driven by someone who looked exactly like I did. It pulled into the rest area and parked on the other side of the building. That's when I understood. The highway wasn't looping. I was. Or rather, time was looping. I was experiencing the same 7-minute cycle over and over again, encountering myself from different points in the cycle, watching myself repeat the same journey endlessly, without ever actually reaching Holbrook or escaping or progressing anywhere. The rest area wasn't an escape. It was a way station where the loops reset, where drivers could refuel and restart the cycle, perhaps without even realizing they were doing it. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off my engine, sitting in my cab with my hands gripping the wheel, trying to figure out what would happen if I simply refused to continue. If I just sat here and waited to see what the highway would do to someone who stopped participating in its loop. I sat there for hours, watching the rest area through my windshield, waiting for something to happen. Other trucks would pull in, park for a while, refuel, and leave. I recognized some of them from previous cycles, the same vehicles appearing and disappearing in patterns that suggested they were also trapped in this endless loop. But none of the drivers seemed aware of what was happening. They'd get out, stretch, use the restroom, buy coffee, and get back on the road like they were just taking normal breaks on a normal highway, completely oblivious to the fact that they were about to repeat the same mile of road endlessly, until they either broke the cycle or accepted it as their new reality. Around what I thought was midnight, a man in a dark uniform approached my truck. He looked like a rest area attendant, but there was something off about him. His movements were too fluid, too synchronized, like he was following a choreographed script that he'd performed thousands of times before. He tapped on my window, and I rolled it down despite every instinct screaming at me not to engage with him. He asked me if I needed anything, if my truck was having mechanical issues, if I was all right. His voice was pleasant and professional, but underneath it, I could hear something else. A kind of static, like he wasn't quite human or wasn't entirely present in this moment. I told him that I was experiencing some strange phenomena on the highway, that the mile markers weren't sequential, that I seemed to be repeating the same stretch of road over and over again. The attendant smiled and nodded like I'd just told him the weather was nice. He said that many drivers experienced unusual things on this particular stretch of I-40, that it was a known phenomenon, that some people attributed it to magnetic anomalies or geological formations or the way the landscape reflected light. He said that the best thing to do was to just keep driving, to accept that this section of highway operated by different rules, to understand that fighting against it only made the experience worse. I asked him how long people typically remain trapped in this loop. He seemed to consider the question carefully before responding. He said that time was negotiable in places like this, that some drivers broke through within hours, some within days, and some never broke through at all. They just kept cycling endlessly, unaware that anything was wrong, content to repeat the same journey forever. He said I should go back to sleep in my sleeper cab, that I should try again in the morning. That morning might bring clarity or escape or acceptance, depending on what I was capable of processing. I climbed into my sleeper cab and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling of my truck and listened to the sounds of the rest area. Other drivers getting in and out of vehicles, the hum of vending machines, the occasional sound of a truck engine starting and fading away as someone got back on the road. And underneath all of it, I could hear that same static from the radio, that same voice repeating, "Stay on the road, stay on the road, stay on the road." Like it was a mantra or a warning or a command that I couldn't disobey even if I wanted to. When dawn broke, I got out of my sleeper cab and walked into the rest area building. Inside, everything looked normal. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, vending machines lined up against the walls, bathroom doors marked with standard signage. But when I looked more closely at the vending machines, I noticed that they were selling the same items, stocked in the exact same quantities and arrangement as they had been during my previous visit. The clock on the wall showed the same time, 6:47 a.m., that it had shown the night before. I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like I'd aged years in a single night. My hair was grayer, my face more lined, my eyes hollow with exhaustion and understanding. Behind me in the mirror, I could see other figures, other drivers, other versions of myself from different cycles, all of us caught in this place, all of us trapped in this endless loop. When I turned around, the bathroom was empty. I was alone. I got back on the highway and drove. This time I tried something different. Instead of accepting the randomness of the mile markers, I started keeping a detailed log. I wrote down every marker I passed, the exact time, the exact odometer reading, my fuel gauge level, everything. I drove with scientific precision, trying to find patterns, trying to identify the exact moment where the loop reset, trying to understand the mathematics of this place that had rejected conventional geography. What I discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The mile markers did follow a pattern, but it wasn't a pattern based on actual distance or location. Instead, it seemed to be based on some kind of emotional or psychological resonance. When I was calm and accepting, the markers progressed almost normally. When I was anxious or fighting against what was happening, the markers would jump backward or forward erratically. It was like the highway was responding to my mental state. Like the space itself was conscious and reactive, adjusting its rules based on how I was feeling about my predicament. I tried using this knowledge to escape. I focused on being calm, on accepting the loop, on moving through it with Zen-like detachment. And it worked. Gradually, over the course of what I think was 3 days, but might have been 3 weeks, the mile markers began to progress more sequentially. I started seeing markers in order: 287, 288, 289, 290, and the spacing between them became more consistent. The rest area appeared less frequently. The other looping trucks seemed to fade away. But as I got closer to what might have been escape, something else started happening. The landscape began to change. The desert started looking less real, more painted, more like a theatrical set that was being struck and replaced. The sky took on an artificial quality, like it was a projection that was flickering. The road beneath my tires started to feel less solid, more like I was driving on something that might disappear if I stopped paying attention to it. And the voices on the static became clearer, more insistent, almost pleading with me not to leave, not to abandon this place, not to escape the loop. I realized then that the loop wasn't trying to trap me. It was trying to save me. Something about being on this endless mile of highway, repeating the same journey over and over, was preventing me from reaching whatever was waiting at Holbrook. The mile marker that had been my goal, the destination I'd been striving toward, was something I didn't actually want to reach. The loop was a mercy. The endless cycling was protection. So I stopped trying to escape. I eased off the mental resistance. I allowed myself to accept the randomness, and something shifted. The ride became smoother. The rest area became a familiar comfort rather than a prison. I started seeing the same drivers repeatedly, and we'd nod at each other, acknowledging a shared understanding that we were all part of something larger than ourselves, all participants in a ritual that served purposes we couldn't quite comprehend. That was 3 years ago. I'm still on that same mile of I-40 between Flagstaff and Holbrook, still cycling through the same 7-minute intervals, still passing the same rest area, still seeing the same mile markers in their non-sequential progression. My truck is still running perfectly. My fuel tank somehow never empties. And I've made peace with the knowledge that I will probably never reach Holbrook, that I will probably spend the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be, driving this impossible loop. Sometimes new drivers join the cycle, and I watch them go through the same panic and confusion that I experienced. I try to warn them, try to tell them that fighting against the loop only makes it worse, that acceptance is the only way to find peace in this place. Most of them don't listen. They struggle and rage and try to escape. And gradually they either break through to whatever waits in Holbrook, something I'm not sure I want to know about, or they surrender like I did and accept their fate as permanent inhabitants of this endless mile. The attendant in the dark uniform still approaches me sometimes, still asks if I need anything, still reminds me that this is just how this particular stretch of highway works. And I've come to understand that he's right. There are places in America, isolated stretches of road where the normal rules don't apply, where distance becomes negotiable and time becomes cyclical. Some people drive through them and never notice anything wrong. Others get caught, like I did, and learn that the most important journey isn't always about reaching your destination. Sometimes it's about understanding that some roads are meant to be traveled forever, and that acceptance is the only way to find peace in the endless repetition. The diner appeared out of nowhere on a stretch of Route 66 outside Shamrock, Texas, a place that shouldn't have existed but did, complete with neon signs and chrome fixtures that looked like they belonged to a different era. My name's Marjorie, and I've been driving long-haul routes across the American Southwest for 16 years. But I'd never seen this particular establishment before, despite having passed this same exit dozens of times. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. And I was hungry enough that I didn't question the sudden appearance of the diner. I pulled off the highway and parked my rig in the gravel lot, noting how empty the place seemed despite the neon signs glowing in the windows, promising food and hospitality. Inside, the diner was frozen in time. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, a jukebox in the corner playing music from the 1950s. But what struck me immediately was that every single person inside turned to look at me the moment I walked through the door. There were maybe a dozen people scattered throughout the diner, and they all stopped whatever they were doing, eating, drinking coffee, staring out windows, and looked directly at me with expressions that contained no recognition but absolute certainty that they knew exactly who I was. The waitress behind the counter smiled and called out a greeting using a name that wasn't mine. One of the customers stood up and waved me over to his booth, addressing me by a completely different name. The old man at the counter turned on his stool and nodded, calling me by yet another name, one I'd never heard before. I froze in the doorway, processing what was happening, trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank or if I'd somehow wandered into an alternate reality where I was known by multiple identities. The waitress approached me, a woman with hair styled in victory rolls and a uniform that matched the era of everything else in this place. And she took my arm gently, guiding me toward a booth with a kindness that felt almost maternal. She told me that it was so good to see me again, that it had been such a long time, that they'd all been wondering when I'd come back. I tried to tell her that she had me confused with someone else, that I'd never been here before, that my name was Marjorie, not whatever name she'd just called me. But she just smiled and told me that I was Marjorie, yes. But I'd had so many names, lived so many lives, taken so many different routes that eventually all the identities started to blur together. She said that this diner was a place where people like me, people who spent their lives on the road, people who were constantly moving, constantly changing, could stop and remember who they really were underneath all the different versions of themselves. She placed a menu in front of me, but before I could open it, she said something that made my blood run cold. She said I must be getting hungry for the usual. And then she listed off a series of dishes, each one something I specifically loved. Each one something I'd never ordered at any diner before, but that I recognized as my own particular preferences with absolute certainty. I asked her how she knew what I liked to eat when I'd never been here before. She tilted her head and said that I'd been here many times, that I always sat in this same booth, that I always ordered the same meal, that I always left the same amount as a tip, that I always drove the same route afterward toward whatever destination I was trying to reach. She said the names changed because I was always running from something different, always trying to escape some previous version of myself. But the core of me remained the same. A woman on the road, a woman who couldn't stop moving, a woman who was trapped in a cycle of eternal driving that she couldn't quite escape. The other customers started talking to me then, each one addressing me by a different name, each one claiming to have known me before in different contexts and different lives. The man in the first booth said he'd seen me drive through Nevada in 1987. And I'd looked exactly the same as I did now, unchanged by the passage of time. The woman at the counter said she'd known me years ago on a different highway, in a different state, with different cargo in my truck, but with the same exhausted eyes. The old man said he'd watched me pass this same diner countless times over the course of what he claimed were decades. Always looking for something, never finding it, never stopping long enough to rest. I stood up from the booth, backing toward the door, telling them all that they were crazy, that this wasn't real, that I needed to get back on the road. But as I moved toward the exit, I caught sight of the window, and what I saw through it made me stop dead. In the parking lot, I could see multiple versions of my truck, same make, same model, same color, arranged in rows like they were all mine, all waiting for me, all ready to continue some endless journey. When I looked at the other customers more carefully, I realized that some of them looked familiar in ways that went beyond the diner. I'd seen their faces before, on the highway, in different trucks, heading in different directions, but always with the same empty expression that suggested they were also trapped in something, caught in some kind of eternal loop. The waitress touched my shoulder gently and said that I didn't have to understand it yet, that eventually I would, that running from my own past always led back to this same diner. She said that the highway was full of people like me, drivers who couldn't stop, couldn't settle, couldn't accept that they needed to rest. She said that the diner existed at a junction point between different versions of reality, different timelines where I'd made different choices and become different people. She said that every version of me converged here sometimes, all of us recognizing each other without quite understanding why. All of us eating the same meal and leaving the same tip and continuing down the same roads we'd been traveling forever. I forced myself to move, forced myself to walk toward the door despite the overwhelming sense of unreality pressing down on me. When I reached the parking lot, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. On the side of each truck in the rows, someone had painted a name. The first truck said Margaret. The second said Mary. The third said Martha. Name after name, each one a variation of my own, each one a different identity I'd apparently lived, each one belonging to a different version of me who'd driven through different eras and different landscapes, but always toward the same mysterious destination. I climbed into my own truck, or what I thought was my own truck, though I couldn't be entirely certain anymore, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I watched the diner in my mirrors, and I realized that the other customers were standing in the windows, watching me leave with expressions that suggested they already knew I'd be back, that I couldn't escape this pattern any more than they could, that we were all part of something larger and older than ourselves, all inhabitants of roads that refused to let us go. I drove through the night, trying to convince myself that the diner was an anomaly, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and loneliness and too many miles. But as dawn broke and I approached the next town on my route, I saw something that made me realize the truth. The graveyard appeared on my right, ancient and sprawling, filled with headstones that stretched back decades. And on those headstones, I could read names. Margaret, Mary, Martha, Marjorie, dozens of variations all listed with dates that spanned from the 1950s to the present day. They were all me. All different versions of me, all having died at different times, but somehow all still driving, still moving down the highways, still unable to escape the cycle that had claimed us. I realized then that I'd been dead for a long time, that I'd died on some highway years ago, and had been driving my own ghost ever since. Unable to accept the finality of it, unable to stop moving, unable to surrender to rest. The diner was where all the dead drivers converged, where all the versions of me that had existed across different timelines and different deaths could recognize each other. And the cycle would continue. I would keep driving, keep seeing that graveyard appear and disappear in my mirrors, keep returning to that diner where waitresses who'd been dead for decades would greet me by names I'd never quite learned to recognize as my own. I drive still, every day, every night, traveling roads that feel increasingly unreal, passing other trucks driven by people who look familiar in ways I can't quite explain. And sometimes, when I'm tired enough, or sad enough, or lonely enough, pull into that diner again. and the waitress greets me by another name, places my usual meal in front of me, and tells me gently that it's time to remember who I really am. Underneath all the identities, all the roads, all the endless driving that refuses to let me rest. The CB radio had been dead for weeks, just static and silence, which was fine by me because I preferred the quiet anyway. My name's Darren, and I've been driving through Appalachia for the better part of 20 years, running routes through the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia, where the roads twist like serpents and the cell phone signal is basically non-existent. I liked it that way. The isolation, the lack of connectivity, the sense that I existed in a pocket of the world where modern technology hadn't quite penetrated. But 3 weeks ago, during a run through the hollers outside Beckley, the forgotten CB radio that had been sitting in my cab for years suddenly crackled to life. I was so startled that I nearly drove off the road, my hands jerking on the wheel as an unfamiliar voice emerged from the static, speaking in a tone that was too clear, too present, like the radio had never actually been broken at all. The voice introduced itself with a call sign I didn't recognize, and it asked if I was receiving the transmission. I picked up the mic hesitantly, not sure if I wanted to engage with whoever was broadcasting on a frequency that should have been dead. But I answered anyway, told them I was receiving, asked who they were and where they were broadcasting from. There was a pause, too long, too deliberate. And then the voice responded by saying it was broadcasting from everywhere and nowhere, that it existed on frequencies that most people couldn't access, that it had chosen me specifically because I'd been driving these roads long enough to understand the deeper truths that existed beneath the surface. I told them they were crazy, that I was going to turn off the radio, that I didn't have time for whatever game they were playing. But before I could reach for the dial, the voice started transmitting obituaries. Not news reports, not announcements, but actual obituaries. Detailed accounts of people's lives, their accomplishments, their failures, the exact dates and times of their deaths. And every single obituary was for someone I knew. Not well, but I'd seen them around, knew them from truck stops or diners or other places along my regular routes. Tommy Henderson died 3 days ago in a single vehicle accident on Route 60. Susan Marks died yesterday from a sudden heart attack at home in Hinton. David Chen died 2 hours ago when his truck went off a bridge in Bluefield. I pulled over at the nearest rest area, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what I was hearing. I told the voice that it was lying, that these people couldn't be dead, that I'd seen some of them just last week. The voice responded calmly that, yes, I had seen them last week, that they were still alive then. But they wouldn't be alive now, that the obituaries were being broadcast before they were technically dead, that the transmission was coming from a point in time that slightly preceded the present moment. It said that was the only explanation for how it could know things that hadn't happened yet, for how it could predict deaths with such specificity and accuracy. Over the next few hours, as I drove through the Appalachian Mountains, the voice continued broadcasting obituaries. And with each one I would find out later, through CB chatter from other drivers or through calls to dispatch or through news I'd see at truck stops, that the person described in the obituary had indeed died at the exact time and in the exact manner specified. The voice was predicting deaths with 100% accuracy, and with each passing hour, I grew more convinced that I was either going insane or experiencing something that existed outside the normal boundaries of reality. Then, around midnight, the voice changed its tone. It became quieter, more intimate, like it was speaking directly into my ear rather than broadcasting across a frequency. It told me that it had been monitoring my transmissions, that it had been following my route for years, that it had something very specific to tell me. It said that according to its readings, according to the broadcasts it was receiving from the future, I had approximately 6 hours left to live. It said that I would die in a truck accident in the mountains, that my truck would go off a bridge, that the impact would be instantaneous, that I wouldn't suffer. It said that knowing this, knowing the exact time and manner of my death, was a gift, a chance to prepare, a chance to make peace with what was coming. I wanted to turn off the radio. I wanted to stop listening to this voice that was predicting my death with a certainty that made my skin crawl. But I was paralyzed, frozen behind the wheel, listening as the voice continued its broadcast. It started reading other obituaries, but now it was reading obituaries for people I loved. My ex-wife in Charleston, my sister in Cincinnati, my daughter in Louisville. Each one died at a specific time, in a specific manner, all of them occurring after my own death by hours or days. The voice told me that my death was like a domino, that once I fell, everyone connected to me would fall as well, that the broadcast was simply documenting the cascade of deaths that would follow. I forced myself to move, forced myself to turn off the CB radio with a hand that felt disconnected from my body. But immediately, the radio turned back on of its own accord, the voice returning, undeterred by my attempt to silence it. It said that turning off the radio wouldn't help, that the broadcast was already inside my head, that I would hear it whether the physical device was on or off, that the transmission had penetrated too deeply into my consciousness to be dismissed or ignored. It said that I should at least use my remaining time wisely, that I should drive toward a place I loved, that I should make peace with my impending death instead of spending my final hours in denial and fear. The sun came up, and I was still driving through the mountains, the voice still broadcasting obituaries, still counting down my remaining hours. 3 hours left. 2 hours left. The voice became more insistent, more urgent, telling me that I needed to prepare, that I was approaching the bridge where my accident would occur, that I could see it in the distance if I looked carefully. I did look, and sure enough, there was a bridge ahead of me, spanning a particularly deep gorge. Exactly the kind of place where a truck accident would be catastrophic and fatal. I drove toward it knowing that according to the voice, this was where I would die. But as I approached the bridge, something changed. The voice's tone shifted from certainty to confusion. It started broadcasting conflicting information. My death would occur at 8:47 a.m. No wait. 9:15 a.m. No wait. The broadcast was unclear. The future was becoming unstable. The signal was degrading. The voice told me that something was interfering with the transmission, that something was disrupting its ability to predict with accuracy, that I was doing something that was changing the outcome. I realized what was happening. The voice had predicted that I would drive toward the bridge and go off it at a specific time. But by knowing the prediction, by being aware of what was supposed to happen, I had changed the outcome simply by having that knowledge. The future couldn't be predicted with perfect accuracy, because the act of prediction itself altered the future. The voice had undermined its own certainty by telling me when and how I would die. I pulled off the road just before the bridge and sat there, engine idling, listening to the voice spiral into what sounded like panic or frustration. It started broadcasting all possible futures, versions of my death, yes, but also versions where I survived, where I lived, where I went on to have decades more of driving ahead of me. The broadcast became chaotic, contradictory, ultimately meaningless. The voice couldn't predict my future anymore because it had already shown me one version of it. And by showing me, it had destroyed its own predictive authority. The radio went silent. Not dead, not broken, but genuinely quiet. A silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I sat there for a long time, waiting for the voice to return, waiting for the broadcast to resume. But it didn't. Whatever that frequency was, whatever entity had been broadcasting obituaries and death predictions, it seemed to have abandoned me once its accuracy became compromised. I drove away from that bridge and back toward the highway, and I've never turned that CB radio on again. But I still hear it sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the mountains. I hear static that almost sounds like voices. Almost sounds like it's trying to form words, trying to broadcast something. And I wonder about all the other drivers out there on America's roads. Drivers who might have picked up that same frequency. Drivers who might have heard that same voice predicting their deaths. Drivers who might not have realized that knowing about their fate was the only way to escape it. If you're listening to this and you ever hear a voice on your CB radio broadcasting obituaries, broadcasting deaths, broadcasting information about futures that haven't happened yet, understand that the prediction itself becomes the escape route. Knowledge of your death is the only way to avoid it. If you've experienced something strange on the road, if you've encountered phenomena that defied explanation, if you've survived something you shouldn't have survived, share your story. You can find more chilling tales and connect with others who've experienced the unexplainable on our YouTube channel, Verified Fears. Subscribe now for more trucker horror stories from America's creepiest roads. And remember, some transmissions are better left unheard, but your story deserves to be told.